Welcome, our impressionable audiences, to the second episode of our podcast, The Global Overpass, where we debate and deliver the best hard hitting analysis of political, social, and cultural issues in current news stories from across the globe. My name is Michael Poon, and here again is my co host, Andy St. John.
Hello, in this second episode, we have tons to cover this week from the west to the east. But we're going to give a little brief intro about ourselves so that new audiences who are listening know who we are. Michael, take it from here.
Sure thing. Again, my name is Chian Poon, but my friends call me Michael. I'm from KL, the capital of Malaysia. I'm a journalism student from the University of Toronto Scarborough. My minor is in political science and comparative politics and international relations. What about you, Andy?
Well, my name is Andy St. John, and I'm from Toronto, Canada. I also am a journalism student from the University of Toronto Scarborough. My minor is also political science and film studies, and fun fact, I also have 2 cats and 2 dogs.
So, our podcast seeks to educate, debate, and analyze political, social, and cultural issues with the overall goal of allowing the public to understand a global perspective towards contributing to the discussion of global affairs. So, who better than us to be your guides? Two poli-sci/journal students obsessed with news to break down these subjects. So, to explain how our podcast works, we reviewed 3 news stories derived from news articles that have happened before and during the first week of March. That is worth talking about more in detail.
Then we discuss, analyze, and debate the news stories and hope we could educate or give a little more context to everyone who's listening on the issues that are focused on from these news stories. Sometimes we'll have a guest on the show.
So, let's get right into it. Let's start off with the first news story of the week. The first story of the week is about the Sputnik vaccine and vaccine diplomacy. So this story is titled Europe Starts Review of Russia's Sputnik V COVID-19 Vaccine to Try to Overcome Shortages as New Variants Appear. And this is from the Globe and Mail, and it's written by Eric Reguli. So, a brief description of the story. So, Russia has this new vaccine to fend off COVID 19, and this vaccine is called the Sputnik V. And interestingly, this vaccine was the first one to come out in the world during this pandemic. And this story basically guides how this vaccine is going through different reviews, especially in the EU countries, as they have a bit of a minor misunderstanding or they're just hesitant about this vaccine in general, as they did conduct a test that this vaccine is only 92 to 93% effective compared to the standard COVID vaccine rate, which is 95%. So, Andy, what do you think about this story in your perspective in a way?
Well, I mean, if the difference between it is like 3%, and a lot of the other vaccines, like the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Johnson and Johnson one, and I think Mondera, I mean, like the Pfizer, the Mondera and the AstraZeneca and the Johnson and Johnson one, it's like 66 to 72% efficiency. I have no idea what the Sputnik vaccine's against, like the variants. My thoughts on Sputnik 5 vaccine is, well, when it obviously first came out, I was like absolutely skeptical because they were the first in the world to come out with it, and I was kind of like, okay, guys, what are you trying to do here? You're pulling people's leg. You clearly cut a lot of safety corners, even though it was later proven to be safe, and I still am a little skeptical of it. I'd be more comfortable with having like a Chinese vaccine or like an Indian-made vaccine, just because they did put a lot more effort into safety reviews. I think the interesting thing that I know of is, I'll get to this later, but it's about Israeli-Palestinian relations. But I have very mixed feelings about it. If the government of Canada wants to order it and they decide it's later safe, absolutely, I'm okay with it. I'll take it if they declare it to be safe. So, but I'd rather have a Chinese vaccine over a Russian one, to be honest with you.
Interestingly, this vaccine, it came during the phase 3 of clinical trials around the world. So Russia produced this vaccine when everyone else was still in their phase 3 of clinical trials. And now the reports are showing that it is effective. Interestingly, this article does focus more on how, since this vaccine is basically being heavily reviewed by developed countries. That now it's uh, more on developing countries. So right now, this vaccine is more exported to African countries, South American countries, and
South America, from what I
certain
understand. Yeah.
yeah, and also certain Asia countries that are in the developing stage, or more like developing Asian countries. So this tactic is essentially that they're focusing on developing countries as a way to build an alliance. It's a multilateral approach, and it's a great way in that sense because these countries that Russia is targeting, they're gonna be, I would say, maybe in the depth of Russia in the future. What do you think about that?
Mhm. Well, the one thing I want to say, Japan's actually interested in the virus, the vaccine for first world countries, so that's something interesting. An interesting thing to compare it to is if you know anything about China or the People's Republic of China, like mainland China, is they were employing a similar strategy like Russia with diplomacy. So they basically build up like infrastructure in a lot of African countries, and they make them switch like the recognition of like Taiwan to the PRC and stuff. So it is kind of a similar strategy where they build up infrastructure, and that allows them to gain trade roads into Africa and have more influence in the politics in that area and so on. So it is a similar tactic. I think a lot of other people don't, especially the United States, when it comes to weapons. I mean, this is another facet of history that we're seeing repeat itself over. Except I don't think it will be as big as China with infrastructure projects, but I think it is repeating a similar pattern in history. I think.
Well, interestingly as well, this vaccine. So there's this statement that was produced by one of the leaders in the EU countries that says that as long as it passes the EMA approvals, which is essentially the European Medicines Alliance approvals or agencies, I might get that wrong. Apologize if I did get that wrong. But if it does go approved from that agency, then they're willing to use it. But it's also in that case of Russia's history, if you know what I mean by that. Russia has a very
Mhm.
difficult history with the rest of the world. If we're going all the way back from the previous world wars to the Cold War, and now that Russia is
Even further
leading
back.
even further back as well, like leading, and they're also leading on this vaccine export. Like they're the first ones to make the vaccine. They essentially have leverage. And this is a bad look on a lot of developed countries.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with Europe is you also have Hungary and like Serbia, which are both European countries. I mean, Hungary is a member of the EU, and I think Slovakia recently proved it too. So they're breaking apart from the bloc, which is interesting. So I mean, Hungary we know is to be sort of a right wing government. They're very close ties with Russia. They're very interested in having good relations with Russia. So that's a very interesting thing. And so it is interesting. Like a lot of countries are sort of breaking off because they're getting fed up with just waiting for vaccines, especially AstraZeneca. And I don't know about Moderna and Pfizer, but it is interesting to see. I think even Denmark, which is like pretty staunch ally of the West in the United States, is like even breaking off and reviewing it on its own. I think people are just so fed up with the virus they're looking for any excuse to go back to normal life. Like the quicker the better. And if they do judge the vaccine to be safe, you know what? Power to Russia. I'll say that.
I do have a question to ask you.
Hmm.
So, I know that your family is certainly going to apply for the COVID-19 vaccines, right? Do you guys get to pick
Yeah.
which vaccines you want?
I have no idea. So my grandma's getting her vaccine in 2 weeks from today, I believe. So she'll probably either get the Moderna or Pfizer one because I think there's more of that now. Because we just approved the AstraZeneca vaccine last week, and then the Johnson and Johnson one. I have a feeling we probably won't be able to choose what vaccine we get. I would love to get the Pfizer one out of all the vaccines, just because with the side effects it isn't as severe as the Moderna one. But it all really just depends on what's available at that particular. I'll probably go to my family doctor or pharmacy to get it. It really depends on what's available there. And what my government has been saying to people is, you know what, if the vaccine works, take whatever you can get because it provides you protection. It stops you from getting the virus, stops you from ending up in the hospital with severe illness. So take whatever you can get. It doesn't matter what the efficiency of the vaccines are, they're all good vaccines.
So that's interesting to hear, and we share the same story in that sense. So my parents, who reside in Malaysia, they did tell me that they don't get to pick the vaccine either, and the only a couple of vaccines are now starting to export to Malaysia. One of them is
Mm-hmm.
AstraZeneca, and I would say that if the Sputnik V vaccine does get to export to Malaysia, in that sense, if I were them and hearing these reports from, the COVID-19 news that certain vaccines have certain rates of success, you would want to choose the one that has the higher amount of success. So, but you can't.
Obviously, I think that's what everyone wants, right?
Of course, you want the highest rate of success of that
Mm-hmm.
vaccine. You want that particular vaccine, but at this point of age or at this point of time, we're so deep into the pandemic, you can't really choose. So, the skepticism about the Sputnik V vaccine, it's definitely something that people have a worry about, but it's also something they can't choose.
Mm-hmm. I'm not anti-vaccine or anything at all, but I can understand why some people have skepticism over the COVID vaccine. Just it is a fairly new vaccine, and I can understand why that seems scary. But at the same time, it's not. It hasn't been rushed. They've been doing this for years. I think like the Pfizer Mondera ones, they're based upon previous existing data and technology from they're trying to develop a SARS vaccine. So because it is a similar virus, I think they're similar cousins, right? Is that correct?
There are some similarities. I just know that the SARS virus it was transmitted initially, or it was originally from a zoonotic species, right? The
Yeah,
same
same
with
same
COVID
sort of
19.
origin as COVID, right? So well, we could talk about the origin of COVID another day, but yeah, kind of a similar origin. Like supposedly the wet food market, even where COVID started, that wasn't even where the disease even came from. Supposedly that's something I've been reading. So it was maybe the site of a super spreader event. They don't really know. But the interesting thing I want to point out with the Sputnik vaccine is this is the last sort of thing I want to talk about related to diplomacy. It was Israel Palestine. I was talking to someone from Palestine recently, and I'm like, "Oh, do you have any vaccines there?" Because like, if you know anything about Israel, I think they've like vaccinated like 96% of their population, which is like absolutely ridiculous, like the highest in the world of any nation. But you also have to think they're Israel. There's only 8 million people there. They know how to deal with disasters and emergencies because of all the wars that they've been in and stuff. So they know how to really mobilize and create networks and stuff. But apparently they've been blocking into the West Bank, I think, in the Gaza Strip. Even though I've heard really mixed things, so it is interesting to, from a diplomatic standpoint, of all these vaccines. I mean, I even think like France and Italy have blocked like shipments of the AstraZeneca vaccine to like Australia, which is like pretty ridiculous. I don't think it's going to lead to like the fall of the European Union and like them looking at the Sputnik vaccine, even though because they have a very bad distrust of Russia. I don't think it'll lead to the fall of the European Union. I think it will. I think COVID overall will erode a lot of people's trust in the European Union, but I do think it will survive. And the UK leaving it doesn't help, and I do hope one day that they rejoin. But it is a tough situation because you don't want to become subservient to Russia. But I don't think it's going to be like what the case with China is with all these infrastructure projects in Africa. But yeah, those are just my thoughts. Do you have anything else to add, Michael?
So, interestingly, our first episode, we talked about the COVAX program developed by the United Nations for vaccine distributions to underdeveloped countries. So, essentially, now that Russia is targeting developing countries for them purchasing their vaccines, this COVAX program is still it's done, it's created, it's founded, but it's very slow when it comes to distributing their vaccines. So in the case of diplomacy, Russia is they're really going for it. They're thriving, and essentially they're beating the United Nations COVAX program. And at one point, they could really lead or become a superpower, a real country superpower in that sense, if this goes well. if this goes well, for sure.
Well, I think the one thing with the Sputnik V vaccine, I think they're like going to make 2 billion doses of it. So that's also going to make them very powerful. I mean, they'll have the power to vaccinate like 1 billion people, which is like, I don't know, like 15% of the world's population, which is a pretty big deal. So, yeah. Do you have anything else to add before we move on to our next topic, Michael?
No, that'll be all for now. Okay, so our second topic of this episode, we will be talking about the Syrian Civil War. And there's this article by CBS News written by Mabel Kabani. The title of it is called A Decade of Civil War in Syria. A decade. So it's the 10th anniversary of this
Mm-hmm.
horrible civil war in Syria
According to Wikipedia, the anniversary is on the 15th of March, so we actually are coming up in like in 10 days.
in
So
10
we're right
days.
around the corner from it. Yeah.
And also, this article, it describes briefly, or I'm going to describe briefly on this article, that this decade long conflict began in 2011.
I
Since
remember when it
then,
started. That's wild. I remember when it started.
it was, I was probably about in middle school, high school. It's been a long time now.
Yeah, I was in grade six. I remember around that time. Actually, this is where I got my interest in politics around that particular period of time with the Arab Spring. That's what really started my interest in politics. So this is a very interesting story for me to follow. I mean, this has probably been the bloodiest conflict of our lives that we've lived through. I mean, we've obviously lived through Afghanistan and Iraq, but we only remember the aftermath of that. I was only two when 9/11 happened, right? And then I have no memory of the Iraq invasion. I do remember when ISIS popped up and all that, and I remember like the aftermath, like the U.S. pulling out in 2011. But it is interesting to reflect upon it, and yeah, you don't hear about it in the news as much as you do, but it is still a very very deadly conflict, especially with COVID in the mix there now. I have no idea how severe COVID has been in Syria, but I could probably look that up now to answer. Michael, what are your thoughts on it?
So it's interesting of this decade long civil war. So interestingly, just to briefly describe what this article is, it just says that it's been a long fight, and essentially that since then, there's been about 400,000 Syrians who have been killed, 5 million have become refugees, 6 million have been internally displaced, and 12 million are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, according to the World Bank and United Nations. And they've also
Well,
stated
and
that
COVID
one
on
of
top of
the
it too, right?
on COVID on top as well. But the interesting parts of this article, for some people who aren't as caught up on this issue, is essentially that this civil war is against the protesters who are fighting for humanitarian rights against its current government, and that leader of the current government is the president of Syria. His name is Bashar al-Assad, and he is the leader of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party of the Syria region. So Bashar al-Assad, he's been in the news multiple times. A lot of world leaders have criticized him. They've talked about how his use of chemical warfare has been done in this Syrian war. They used a specific chemical agent called sarin, and also they've also used modern warfare where they bomb their own hospitals. And in this case, it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years
It's pretty messed
since this
up.
has
Yeah.
happened.
I
It's
mean,
pretty messed up.
I remember back in 2013. Yeah, I remember back in 2013 when they're making a bunch of fuss about the U.S. joining the Civil War after the chemical weapons attack happened. I don't know. It was like in 2013, if I can remember, and they didn't end up doing it. I will say one of the failures of Obama's presidency was not doing more about the Syrian Civil War. But at the same time, if he were to get more involved, he could run to another quagmire like Iraq and make the situation worse. So you need to want to risk unnecessary American lives, for example, because they didn't want another repeat of the Iraq War, which is understandable. But I do think They should have done more. And I mean, they did eventually get involved because of ISIS and all that. But I mean, ISIS is no longer a significant threat in that area. I mean, looking back upon it, I mean, I was just looking at a map of the current situation in Syria. I think the majority of the country is under control by the government, and then it's like the Kurds and the Turkey's also in there, and then there's also still a fair amount of under control by the rebels. But the country, the civil war, is going more and more in favor of Bashar al-Assad. So it will be interesting to see what happens to him after the civil war is done, whenever that ends. Again, comparing it to Myanmar, which has been going on for 70 years, and then Lebanon, which is going on for 30 years. I mean, who knows how long this conflict will be going on for, because you have various different ethnic groups in it, especially the Kurds in Turkey.
You know, you mentioned like the US doesn't want to completely intervene. I get that. It's also like I feel like this issue doesn't just involve the need for the US help. We get that the US is the number one economy in the world right now. But I feel like in this issue, other countries could have helped more. But the
Well,
issue with that,
Russia, for example, has been the most involved, I think. And then
they
Iran has
have,
also been
yeah.
there a lot of the Hezbollah. There's so many different groups in there, it's hard to keep track, but I think the ones you really need to pay attention to are it's like the Syrian Democratic Forces, what's left of ISIS, the government, and then the Kurds and Turkey. Those are sort of the main groups you need to focus on. There's way more. I mean, I have the Wikipedia article pulled up right now in front of me, but it's just ridiculous. I mean, even it's apparently under control by the United States. I didn't even know that. So it's just it's ridiculous. Yeah.
It's also that like you can't really intervene because we talk about diplomacy and you only intervene when everyone agrees that this is an issue.
Yeah.
But when we learn about
Well,
world
Turkey's already
politics,
yeah.
but when we learn
Mhm.
about world politics, not everyone agrees. Not everyone compromises. Not everyone
Mhm.
tends to find the same solution that they agree on, and that's why this has went on for a decade. Because not everyone agrees that they should intervene in this civil war of theirs. But a lot of intellectual people would
Well, it is.
disagree on that.
Yeah. Well, it is a very difficult situation. That's the problem, right? So, I mean, I think what ended up happening is the limited intervention that they've had because of ISIS. I think that has been successful. And if you look at neighboring Iraq, I mean, they've been able to largely get rid of ISIS. They still are a problem. There still is a low level insurgency going on in the country. But the Iraqis were able to free their own country by themselves with the assistance of the United States. And you don't want it is very difficult. I mean, who knows what's going to happen after? I mean, because the civil war, I think Bashar al-Assad is going to win whenever it's going to end, or he somehow dies before the civil war ends. Or I mean, who knows, right? I mean, the one thing I really hope that happened to him, he shipped off to the Hague and he's tried for war crimes. But again, who knows how likely that's going to be? So, and then you add COVID on top of that too, and that makes it even more interesting with dire humanitarian disasters in like
Assistance.
Yemen, for
Yeah.
example, assistance, and then like disasters also in neighboring Yemen, which is also another very interesting conflict. We can probably save that for another podcast though in the future. But yeah, I don't know. Just looking back on it after 10 years and not hearing about it as much as I did in the news anymore, it is interesting to see how conflicts change over time and how the Western media covers it. I mean, how much did it cover it in Malaysia?
Well, it's definitely we talk about like how media exposure this is. It's definitely not as covered in Malaysia, but not to be too pessimistic on this situation. For the past 10 years, it's not like nothing has been done. Because according to this article, when it comes to looking at the future, there are several uh, people involved when it comes to the civil war who have been arrested. So there's one. He is a former Syrian intelligence service agent named Iyad Al Gharib, and he was sentenced to 4.5 years in jail just about a couple weeks ago for transporting protesters to an interrogation center known for torture. And this was a landmark case, and this is also one of the many arrests. And there was another one where Al Gharib has a couple people involved with him as well in this whole situation, and his name is Anwar Roslan, who was charged for a site responsible for more than 4,000 cases of torture, related to this a whole huge civil war. So there have been a couple of arrests, but this is only very small amount of progress when it comes to lowering the tensions or the violence in the Civil War. But there are some things being done. But to be fair, there could be more that can be done in that sense.
Yeah. Do you have anything else to add before we move on to our next topic, Michael?
Um, that'll be all. So, for our third and final topic of our podcast is about the Uyghur and China ambassador situation. And this article is reported by the Global News and it's titled Chinese Ambassador Calls Reports of Uyghur Genocide Forced Labor Lie of the Century, written by Amanda Connolly. And this article briefly describes that China's ambassador to Canada says that genocide and forced labor of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province are the lie of the century, despite many people in the international community reporting that some things of this situation is credible. And the Chinese ambassador to Canada, his name is Chang Pei Wu, and he held a virtual press conference where he states that the House of Commons in Canada, that they wouldn't really know about the situation because they've never been to the Xinjiang province in China. So, Andy, what do you think about this situation? This situation that's been not getting a lot of media exposure, but it's been reported that Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, China, have been detented or kept in forced labor camps because of how they're treated or how they portray themselves in the world when it comes to the rise of Muslim terrorism, the rise of the religious extremists, and now that we understand that China is actually a multi ethnic country and they're keeping Uyghur Muslims in detention camps in Xinjiang. What do you think about this, Andy?
Well, you already have an idea of my personal feelings, and I have very, very strong personal feelings about it. I understand we don't wish to say certain words about how I feel about it, but I think it's absolutely deplorable, and I think the Canadian government should absolutely recognize it as. Do you mind if I say the word, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
I think the Canadian government should recognize it as a genocide. It is. It is similar to what because they're putting them into concentration camps and they're forcing them to change their culture. It does sound very similar to what the Canadian government did with the Indigenous people or First Nations people here in Canada back in the 19th century. Because basically, from what I understand, is they're forcing them into concentration camps. They're forcing them to learn Mandarin. They're no longer allowed to learn their ethnic language in schools and all that. And I think they've been tearing down mosque and everything. And I have very, very strong feelings about it. I mean, I think who's ever in charge of these camps should be tried for crimes against humanity and genocide. It is similar to the situation in Myanmar with the Rohingya people. Just
Yeah.
yeah, it's this. I wouldn't compare the severity of them, but I think from what I understand, there's like a million Uyghurs in concentration camps in China. And how do you say the name of the province again?
Xinjiang.
Xinjiang. I can't. Xinjiang. Yeah.
Yeah.
What northwestern China? I'll just call it that instead.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it is a form of genocide. At the absolute least, it would be a form of cultural genocide. Like I think they are purposely trying to wipe out their culture. Because from what I understand, China in the past, this is a similar case of Tibet, is that they moved tons of Han Chinese people into areas that are not predominantly Han Chinese. And this is a very similar to what Russia did when the Soviet Union still existed. They would move Russians into like Ukraine and like the Baltic countries. And this was known as Russification. And today you have a huge problem, especially if Ukraine, you have these huge Russian minorities who still feel very loyal to their home country. So it does create big problems for that. I have very, very strong feelings about it, if you cannot tell.
Well, this issue is people need to realize how big this issue is because essentially, when we talk about how the Uyghur population are forced into labor camps, in a way, it affects the world in a way that a lot of people don't really know. So interestingly, I read about this recently. The face mask that we wear to protect ourselves from the COVID-19 virus, the ones that if you were wearing the ones made in China, the probability that that mask is made was by the hands of the Uyghur population. Hence, they're placed in labor camps to make masks for the global economy. And it's very interesting to note that your mask that you're wearing on your face is being worn by a person who is uh, allegedly, based on the reports from the Chinese ambassador, worn by the Uyghur population, uh, who they say are not being held in labor camps, but is essentially a way to teach them about the Han Chinese way. This case is just, it really is not that much reported because we talk about how strong China is. It really is a strong economy. It's been expanding very, very not that long ago. Its economy is rising, and a lot of people want to do business with China. So if you talk anything bad about China, they're just not going to do business with you. So it's just simple as that. If you're going to talk about some controversies that they are doing, as reported by the media, they just won't do business, and that will destroy your economy. So there are consequences. That's why this story is not that much reported. It goes the same with this story about the Chinese ambassador Chang Pei Wu. This is a hint to Canada. Are you gonna stand up against us, or do you want to keep doing business? It's plain as simple as that. Like
Well, I'm
what
probably
do
on
you
some
want?
list somewhere now for calling stuff in. I'm probably in some list now for calling the stuff for the Uyghurs genocide somewhere now, probably. So, um, yeah, I don't really know what can happen. I think a really big step is if you had a major Western country like Canada declare this is a genocide, this is what's happening in China. We need to do action about it. We should put sanctions on China. I mean, if you also look at the stuff with Hong Kong that's been going on, I mean, it's another example of it's not cultural genocide what's going on in Hong Kong, but it is sort of a forced attempt at assimilation because they're slowly eroding their rights in Hong Kong, even though they're promised it for like 50 years after. And so they China and even with Taiwan too. I mean, they're slowly trying to erode away what rights they have in Hong Kong, and they've largely taken away in. Yeah, and even if you look overseas, I mean, this is happening here in Canada too. Do you remember UTSC? It was about 2 years ago. You had Kemi, I don't know, say her last name.
Camille Mo?
Yeah, and she was Tibetan, and she was running for student government. But what unfortunately started happening for her was she was getting harassed by Chinese people on social media, and she believed it was it was slash a campaign by the Chinese government slash propaganda that encouraged Chinese people to spam her. And she's very outspoken in the Tibetan community in Canada, which is great for her. But yeah, you do see that happening overseas too. For example, with Kemi, right? So
It's interesting, like you said, activists who are active in Western countries, as long as they're strong Chinese nationals living in these Western countries, they are encouraged to sort of not meddle, but kind of announce the Chinese way of what she or he or they are saying is untrue. And this
Well,
happens
I'm not saying the majority of them
everywhere.
do it. Well, I'm assuming the majority of them don't do it. I feel like the majority of them are good people, but you have individuals who just sort of do it. And I mean, this also happens with a lot of other countries. I mean, you remember all the controversy of Mulan and all that from last year, right? I mean, they filmed part of the movie actually in Xinjiang, which was
In
a
Xinjiang,
really, really big
yeah.
issue for them. That's partially, I keep saying the name wrong. That's partially why Mulan, it wasn't why it bombed in China, but there was a call for to boycott it. And also because the lead actress was in favor of the police in Hong Kong. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. Do you know what it is by chance?
I think it's her name is Liu Yifei. And interestingly, like you brought this up, it's a very interesting subject. That movie production, that Mulan live action movie, it was part of it was filmed in Xinjiang. And they have, like you said, the actress, she and something to point out, the actress is actually, I remember this story vividly because this was reported everywhere. This actress, she she is from China, but she was raised in Western countries. She was raised in America. So a lot of the audience did ask, if you were raised in the Western way, how could you not see the Western perspective of this Uyghur Muslim issue in China? And to my response, I think it's plain obvious that when you're trying to sell a movie and you're making a movie that really is the origins of it from a country that has currently, well, now currently has a lot of controversies, including also the past, if you want to say that, then you obviously want to market to them and that you want to be able to support what that country is saying. So in that case of this actress, she supported the Chinese government on the Hong Kong issue. And even though the reports did found out that this production was filmed in Xinjiang, this issue happening against the Uyghur population actually got more reports on it since then. And there are certain unintended consequences that would lead to more of the media reporting on this issue. So even though this actress, her words are her opinions, to be fair. Everyone has their own opinions and it's fair to them. But, a lot of people disagree with her. But in a way, one of the unintended consequences that more people are learning about this issue that's happening in Xinjiang. That's for sure.
Well, the one really bad thing that Disney did, this is the last point I'm going to bring up about them, is that they actually listed the local Chinese government in that area just to add insult to injury, right? So that is also a problem with a lot of corporations is that they want to be like pro business. They want to be pro Chinese. That's why some Western films have even gone so far to censor themselves. I mean, I think a really infamous example of that would be what is it, like the fourth Transformers movie, Age of Extinction or something, where they're like in Hong Kong and they're trying to show like the Chinese government is like the super effective fighting force and all that, and and they have all these like ridiculous over the top Chinese product placements, and they portray all Chinese as like, oh, I'm super tough, I'm really good at karate, like I'm really cool and badass, right? So it's like,
It's making business with China, man.
yeah,
That's
that's what
what
it
you
is.
need.
Especially the NBA, National Basketball Association.
Oh
That's been a really big
yeah.
issue. Yeah, yeah,
It was about the Houston Rockets or
yeah.
uh their former one of the former like a top in charge of that department in the Houston Rockets. That's a team in the NBA that I think was Daryl Morey, and that he basically said that what's happening to Hong Kong is a bad thing. He tweeted that, and then the Chinese government or people in China they boycotted. They wanted to boycott the NBA, and if you want to know, the NBA has invested a lot of money in the Chinese market, so a lot of their audiences are
Well,
actually
you have Jeremy Lin, right? But
Chinese. Jeremy
he's
Lin.
not that good
But
of a
he's
player.
Taiwanese, I think.
Yeah. Anyway,
But it's also
he's not that good
interesting.
of a player.
Yeah. It's also I do want to bring this one thing. I remember this vividly as well. That censorship, right? China likes to censor a lot of material that they deem is not right for, the public exposure. I remember this TV show that was actually reported in the news. I think it was Last Week Tonight by John Oliver, and it was essentially that uh, this a variety show that they visit a part of Xinjiang, this team, and they brought on a guest, and this guest was a Uyghur. She was a Uyghur Chinese living in Xinjiang, and she was wearing a headdress, a traditional Uyghur headdress, and the entirety of that episode, she was censored. Her whole body was censored because she was wearing, well, it's not just a headdress. She was actually wearing a traditional Uyghur outfit, and they censored her by putting I think it was an animated uh, graphic over her on the TV screen, and they censored her all throughout the episode. You could still hear her speaking, but she was censored all throughout the way, and it was very heavily censored. And it just shows that China is very dead serious when it comes to wanting not a cultural mosaic and not even a melting pot, but they really want a nationalistic method. And it just shows that it definitely isn't the way that the Westerners have been doing when it comes to, America's a melting pot, Canada's a cultural mosaic, but China is just one national unity, and they want it that way, even though it's a multi-ethnic country. What do you think about this, Andy?
It is interesting. I just looked up out of curiosity. I understand there's certain types of films banned in China. So, for example, you can't have films with time travel in it, but that's Avengers Endgame was released in China though, so I don't know how. I think like things that involve superstition, ghost, references to homosexuality, strangeness, unscientific elements, films that are viewed as anti-communist or anti-Chinese, films that can function as a form of Western propaganda,
Yep.
um, films that encourage violence, but surprisingly, no nudity, no sexual content, or explicit sexual content. But you can have films with some extreme violence in it. It's really all over the place.
And also, interestingly, to point out, one of them is also no religious films that are kind of like expanding their prophecy. It goes the same with the Uyghur population because they are a sort of ethnicity that follows a certain type of religion in that way. And China, Han Chinese people, because the majority of China's population are Han Chinese. A lot of them they follow essentially, I think it's Christianity and Buddhism. And like you said, they do ban a lot of Western films that China doesn't agree. Whether it comes to violence, whether it comes to anything R-rated, whether it comes to anything that, like you said, expands Western propaganda, because China is essentially they're following their own word, but their word really won't last long because essentially, if you have your Chinese ambassador to Canada, who is now being pressured to kind of like elaborate on the situation in Xinjiang to literally major politicians in Canada, you know that this issue is now getting the attention of literally maybe everyone in Canada, and I do hope that a lot of people do understand that this is something that's going on. Like, come on, I know that China's censorship is quite strong, but luckily we need, or like we hopefully we need journalists that can cover this topic in the best way possible. To be fair,
Mhm. Do you have anything else to say before we wrap up at all, Michael?
I would like to say one more thing. Interestingly, we
Sure,
talk
go ahead.
about
And
we've
I might
added
respond to
in
it. So,
yeah, like we've added about films. We've added about many things that China is they don't like about the Western cultures, about films, whether it's like products or such, or like the words of like certain politicians. The thing is, I think it's also interesting that China needs to understand. We are now moving onto a certain new world where every country needs to learn about each other. Now it's not the case of the world needs to learn about China. Certainly, it's important that the world does need to learn more about China, but it's also that China needs to learn more about the world, about what works in this world. America is now they're legalizing LGBTQ rights. They're now legalizing cannabis. And certain consequences are there, but there's also good ramifications in that. And we are now living in a world where it's less traditional because new traditions can be easily made. There are certain and newer traditions being made every day, and it's important that China learns about them. They can't just focus on themselves. And it's just interesting to point out that everyone, well, the Chinese government wants to expand their own message to the world, especially the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. They want to expand their message to the world, but they do have to understand expanding their message also means they're getting more media exposure. So anything controversial they do, anything that is a certain X to that agenda of ours or agenda of the whole world where, you know, situations like this are happening, with the Uyghur population being held in detention camps, or even with we previously talked about the Syrian Civil War. The more that you want to expand about your government's message to the world, that means you're also getting more media exposure, and that also means that more of your controversies are going to be brought up to the attention of the world.
Yeah, I have nothing else left to say. I think I got out what I wanted to say. So yeah, I think you had a good point there. So yeah, anything else before we wrap up?
I think that'll be all for today. So, thank you, everyone who will listen to this podcast or won't listen to this podcast, whether you agree with our opinions or our perspectives or whether you don't. That's the whole point of this discussion. We're just trying to educate, debate, and analyze these topics. So, thank you, everyone, for listening to our second episode of our podcast, The Global Overpass. My name is Michael, and my co host, Andy St. John. We would like to wish that you guys have a great week of this beginning of March of 2021. And thank you, everyone. If you do
Whoa, it's
listen
hard
to
to believe.
this, it's hard to believe. Now we're in March 2021. So thank you, everyone. And we hope that you have a great but informative week.
Bye, everyone.